The first question is just following on from the fatherlessness stuff, which using Glen's expression, I fully agree with statistics and the ideas. Sometimes the conclusions I get always a bit concerned about, because when I look at who uses the fatherlessness position, it's often tinged with a very strong, even religious background. It's about bringing back Judeo-Christian hierarchy within society. It's about abolishing the family law court. It's about bringing folk back into divorce and men being back the head of the family. How do you deal with that tension around the whole fatherlessness statistics and conclusions when they can get so easily hijacked by many rogue issues and causes?
I think it's a great question, and it goes to the heart of the problem, which is we need to go beyond the binary, and we need to be able to hold both. We need to hold, like Warren was describing, about the value of the mother and the father in that dynamic. And we know that's not rigid, even though there's flexibility around that, but there's two positions which both serve each other. We need to do that. It is true that when fathers aren't around, generally, not specifically, I think that's a really good phrase to use. Doesn't mean to say that every single child who doesn't have a father is going to do worse than the child next door that does have a father, really. But generally, not specifically, children do worse when dads aren't involved. And that's just, it's a fact. And then we also need to be caring and mindful of the fact that not everyone has a father around. So it's not saying, we're not saying children do better when fathers are around, therefore every single couple should be married and sit together forever. We're just saying they do better, and therefore we need to be mindful of that.
Yeah, and I think, first of all, we should never fear taking a position because somebody we disagree with about other issues agrees with us on that area. So, but most born-again Christians, most very strong people that say the father should be the head of the family, they also want their sons and their daughters to be empathetic. They want their children to do well in school. And the issue is not the father being the head of the family. The issue is there being checks and balances in the family so that both the father and the mother understand that the tension between the two of them, the arguments that they have, are actually often very useful arguments. They're arguments that if neither parent dominates and both parents hear each other, which gets back to the communication issue that I talked about yesterday, which is a huge additional need. If parents are communicating effectively when they're either together or respect each other when they're divorced, which means if they're divorced, there has to be three things that happen that I think almost every conservative and every liberal would agree with, because if they understand the outcome. If you want children after divorce to do almost as well as children will do in an intact family, three things need to occur. The children need to have about an equal amount of time with the mother or the father. Otherwise, the mother's system of parenting dominates the father's, or the father's dominates the mother's. Secondly, you have to have the children, the mother and father, live close enough to each other so that the children don't have to give up activities or friendships to see the other parent that's farther away. Then the children end up resenting seeing the other parent that is the non-primary parent. And third, the child needs to hear and see very little bad-mouthing from mom to dad or dad to mom. And so and if those three things are intact in a non-intact family, the child, at least girl and boy children, by the way, have a much better chance of doing very well. And like Glen said, I compare a child without a dad, as somebody that goes from Perth to Sydney by car, drunk. They're likely to get there without getting into a major accident, but you're certainly increasing the chances of a bad experience.
Gary Marson here. One really question to you. I was actually a bit surprised at your very last statement. You were talking about parenting, but then you said at the end that something to the effect that men will become people that women would want to love. And that suggests to me that unless men become more like women, that they're not deserving of love, and yet men have a whole range of attributes which are deserving of love. I mean, the way they interact with people in general is because they're wired differently, and so that is reflected in the way they behave with their children. And you've already said that there are a whole lot of great attributes and a whole lot of deficits that occur when they don't interact in the way that dads should interact. But and then you have, towards the end, you were talking about the vote on the left and the right. But I mean, on the one hand, you're saying, well, women can do whatever they like, but unless men do more like women, then they don't deserve the love that from a woman, and therefore things won't work out.
Yeah, good point, Gary. Let me clarify that. I actually wrote something more complex than that, but because I realized I was running over on time, I shortchanged it, and you were bright and sharp enough to pick up the distinction. So when men are successful, they are more, their marriages are likely to last much longer. Women are very interested in being married to and remaining married to men who are successful. However, there's a distinction between marriages that last and a woman who is happy. The process that it takes to become successful at work is in tension with the process that it takes to be successful in love. Meaning that if I'm a good attorney, and you, and Gary down here is my opponent, and I'm representing Glen, and if I'm a really good attorney, every time Gary speaks, I'm forming in my own mind's eye a flaw in Gary's argument, and I'm beginning to build up that argument and watch for the first opportunity to interrupt Gary. And if I do that, I may have succeed for Glen as an attorney, but if I take that same skill set, very well refined, home, and every time my wife talks, I listen to her for a couple of seconds, pick up the gist of what she's saying, self-listen, and then interrupt her and so on, the chances are fairly good she'll stay with me because I'm successful, but she won't feel loved by me. And so one of the things that I think it's really important for, one of the things that women have and female energy have to offer us is that as we as men do not become the primary breadwinners, women will look for us, to us for things other than money, which I think is great. So we need to learn emotional communication skills that were not necessary when we were willing to die and be disposable in war and be heroes that were not, or when we are sort of making a great deal of money and the woman stays with us for that reason and forms women friends. So I'm saying we have a whole new set of things to offer. Women are moving into, we are now beginning to value and want women to earn more. We know most men today are not okay with a woman who wants to spend all day at home. So there's a lot of possibility of flexibility of roles, and in that process of developing deeper emotional skills, I think that we're likely to, the blessing on that, in that process, is that love has the potential for being really deep in between men and women, rather than men and women just using each other.
Can I just a follow-up point as well, which is, I really hear the making men more like women, and it's really, for me, it's really not about that. It's about helping human beings be better at getting along together and working in the world we have now. This is the world we have now, and I think we need to equip our sons to live in the world we have now, so that they can be successful in life, in all areas of life. In all areas of life, and the areas of life that are most important to them, and that can be being muscular and sporting, and and being physical, and having an outdoor profession, and it can be loving and caring and nurturing. It's choices are open to us, and it's really not an either or. And actually, the relational skill, that's not a woman's skill. Men can do relationship too, and it's just about us helping boys to develop into relational beings, without throwing out all the other stuff as well. Actually acknowledging what's great and unique and different about boys, and being aware of areas where they can develop and grow. Because when they've got those relational and communication skills, where we as men have got more of those relational and communication skills, then we can make the case for what's good and needed about men and the importance of men in the world of men's work and working with fathers and championing dads and what dads bring and all the rest of it.
It's an observation, both Glen and Warren, in relation to stereotyping, and Glen touched on it with the father of the mummified child, and he wasn't to be believed in court, so it wasn't followed up. Warren, you touched on it with the two billboards, the stereotypical male and that sort of thing. My observations in the last probably 10 years I've been at a university is that stereotypical beliefs and that become perceptions for other people, that they then become false truths, and then there's a whole social misunderstanding based on those things, and we certainly see it here in Australia in relation to family violence. I never knew what family violence was until I went to university, and I never saw it. Didn't even know what it was, and then all of a sudden here I am, a potential abusive husband, father, whatever the case may be. And it's been very, very hard to get that sort of truth, mistruth, whatever you want to call it, be pulled apart and examined. It's just like your thoughts and comments in that from two people coming from two different countries to a third country. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I think, firstly, we see the same thing in the UK, and I'm sure Warren will, he'll let you know what it's like in the States. So what Warren said was, hey, look, that billboard, if it was a black guy, would say it was racist, and we're blind to the sexism. We're blind to the sexism against men and boys. We're blind to the misandry. So we don't have to argue against or fight against all the great stuff that's been done to tackle homophobia, to tackle sexism against women, to tackle racism. We don't have to be against all of that. We can stand alongside that and say, and. I want to give you one of the most powerful words in the English language, and, okay, rather than but. You know, if you say, there's all this stuff about, you know, sexism against women and racism, the gay guys and all the rest of it, but what about the guys? Try and. There's all that stuff, and we also need to be mindful of this. It's just a continuation of that value set to try and include everyone. They are blind to it. They're blind to it. People are blind to it. So that's one part. And the other part is to recognise how things are changing and shifting. So this dialogue is changing and shifting. We've got to get away from the binary. We've got to be inclusive. We can't just have a sort of essentially a pro-feminist and an anti-feminist argument. We need an inclusive argument that goes beyond that and acknowledges the bits of all that, the pro-feminist dialogue, which is completely relevant, and also then fill in the gaps where that's missing. And a big part of that is the work that we do, right? We don't have to be anti-feminist to do that. We can help fill in the gaps beyond that. We don't have to be pro-feminist either, by the way. You know, you have choices. And I'm observing how that's emerging. And I'm seeing in the domestic violence field that what's emerging is now a diversity where non-feminist voices are coming through, where men's organisations are taking responsibility for the issues that men face, as opposed to attacking the other side. Over here, you've got the 1 in 3 campaign, which is one of the best advocacy campaigns for male victims of domestic violence. Over in the UK, we've got an organisation called Abused Men in Scotland, which is doing awesome work helping male victims of domestic violence from a non-feminist perspective. So we've got to be aware as an international network what's working to actually create a new narrative which allows for both, using the word and.
I want to pick up that point and connect it back to Gary Mison's question too, about I think it's really important that we not as men be afraid of learning from women and women's traditional modalities, but it's also part of what I was saying when I was saying that men were really good at coaching and playing physically and creating excitement. It's also important for women to learn from men. And men and women can really do that well. So for example, in the school that I briefly was referring to, which is Urban Dove School in Bedford-Stuyvesant, the teachers are both male and female teachers, but they play with kids the way, normally speaking, men tend to play with kids. Lots of competition, but also yoga, many different types of physical activities are encouraged for 3 solid hours during the day, and then there's the transfer of that coaching mentality and that bond over to coaching against the adversaries of life that the child can't deal with. That seems to be such a magical combination. That is something that dads tend to do fairly naturally, along with boundary enforcement, from which women can learn from men. But when we have a hierarchical structure of saying that the woman has the child outside of marriage and she lets the father in, if the father behaves like she feels a father should behave, and we fathers haven't educated ourselves as to the value of things that we contribute, and we can't even make an argument, no less have equal amounts of power, that's when problems occur. So what we are about, I believe, evolving toward, the best part of what we're evolving toward is both sexes learning from each other's traditional roles and integrating the best. But the dialogue has to occur through knowledge. We have to know that domestic violence is a two-way street. We have to know that, yes, men are more violent outside of the home, and no, they are not more violent inside of the home. Inside of the home, more than 300 studies have been shown that men and women are about equally violent toward each other. And here are the reasons. And beyond the reasons of equality, there is a way to stop domestic violence. And the way to stop domestic violence is very powerful communication training, like I began to refer to yesterday, about knowing how to handle personal criticism without becoming defensive. When people have that training at an early age, or even at a later age, and it's practiced consistently, domestic violence, it decreases. But we need to work politically with people who believe they don't even want to hear that domestic violence is a two-way street. And so we have to be strong enough politically to be able to get that point heard and to go around people who are so ideologically fixed that they're unable to hear that. But in order to do that, the universities have to be confronted. And as long as universities have adopted a Marxist point of view toward feminism and gender roles, which is oppressor versus oppressed, we won't have an opportunity to change the system to an understanding of how the genders are not about oppressor and oppressed, that Marxism and civil rights are false models for male-female relationships in which both sexes sacrifice differently for each other. That needs to be confronted. How do we confront that? We need activists who are willing to sue universities. Because if you don't sue universities for equality, universities cannot respond. I played tennis with the president of Northwestern University in Chicago, and afterwards he didn't know who I was and I didn't know who he was. We finished the game and we said, we shared what we were about, and he said, man, that is just, men's issues never even occurred to me. And I said, do you want to be the first university in the world to really have a sophisticated men's issues program? And without skipping a beat, he said, Warren, I'd be killed within 2 weeks by the feminists. And I said, well, what could I do? What could make that happen? And he said, you'd have to have students at the university sue me for the program, and then I would become the hero by helping the university not be sued. So it didn't take him but a minute to come to that conclusion. And so people like the work that Glen has been doing with Fathers for Justice, we need people at every end of the spectrum. Activists who are willing to take the risks and make noise. We need people who are quiet, loving, and communicative. And we need everybody in between. We have to all work together to create an outcome of greater love.
Yeah, yeah. Hear, hear.
Doing some research in separated families and parenting for mums and dads, and one of your key factors you talk about is having both parents involved, even moving close to each other in that situation. What I read in some research was that that's more likely to occur if the father has the custody, if you like, of the children, to have the mother involved in their lives and the other way around. Have you? Can you comment on that?
Yes, when I did the research for Father and Child Reunion, I found out that what you said is, Tim, is accurate. And here's why. When the father is the primary parent, the father is usually wanting the mother to be involved. That's number one. Number two, the mother very much wants to remain involved. Very few mothers will leave their children and be uninvolved with their children. And so the father and the mother work together to keep the mother involved when the father is the primary parent. When the mother is the primary parent, the mother is far more likely to do gatekeeping and bad-mouthing. Those two things are very well documented on about a 5-to-1 level. And so but it's the gatekeeping that actually keeps the fathers away more than the bad-mouthing. The gatekeeping means that, and from the mother's point of view, to defend the mothers here for a bit, the mothers are feeling like, gee, I took my child over to Dad's on Saturday, and Dad took the child to the playground, and the child came back from the playground. He got into a fight. Where was Dad? He was home watching rugby or football or whatever, but he cares more about football than he does about the child. But from the father's point of view, it's crucial that that child had a chance to be at the playground by himself or herself, and that if they got into a fight, he wants the child to get into a fight when she or he is young enough to be able to process how to avoid fights in the future while the child is still a child. He doesn't want to overprotect the child from interaction with other people to such a degree that that fights don't occur, but on the other hand, life doesn't get learned at an early age. And so by not communicating his intent to the mom, or by having only visitation where the child, just after being beaten up, gets picked up by the mom and goes back to the mom's home, and the mom experiences it through the child's eyes without having the processing take place with the father. That's the type of thing that happens when the child does not have time with the father. So the summary of all that is that children who live primarily with dads do better than children who live primarily with moms after divorce. But that's not because men are better fathers than women are mothers, but it's largely because men, because of the type of dynamics I just described, when a dad is the primary parent, it's more like an intact family where both sexes are involved about equally. When the mom is the primary parent, if she does gatekeeping, the gatekeeping tends to make the dad feel without purpose, like a babysitter. He then goes off and finds another woman who has children, begins to get involved, sees more love in his future with another woman with the children, gets more involved with that family, and begins to neglect his biological children. So that's the dynamic that often happens when after divorce that leads to those outcomes.
Two distinctions to give you. Firstly is to understand why that happens, to add another layer. Intact family, traditional roles, mum's there all the time, dad goes in and out. So it seems much easier and more natural when you're separated for mum to be there all the time and to dad go in and out. So mum feels really challenged when she isn't there all the time because her traditional role is being challenged. There's a way beyond that, which isn't just about the stuff that Warren said, which I agree with, is that if you look at the trends around the world, there was some good research done across Europe about how likely are fathers to share parenting after divorce. So what we found is that in Sweden, fathers are 3 times more likely to share parenting than fathers in the UK. 3 times more likely, separated fathers. What the difference is there is that shared parenting is promoted from birth, and fathers are given close to, Iceland's the closest now, fathers are given close to equal rights and equal support from birth to be involved. So there's a culture from birth of sharing care, and that's in the modern world, one of the biggest protectors against fathers being removed after separation, because the culture of sharing care already exists.
G'day, Glenn and Warren. My name's Damien, at the back in the middle. It's more a couple of comments. Racism and homophobia are actually social determinants of health. I'm pretty sure Miss Andrews not. I haven't come across a study that says as such. So I don't know if it's ready for that and yet. Warren, in your presentation, you had a graph up there around that spoke to marriage. I don't believe marriage to be a stabiliser of a good family. I think a good relationship is. And thirdly, those 2 chairs that are vacant, at the next one I'd like to see a gay father and an Indigenous father.
Great point. On the diversity, I completely and utterly agree with you.
Not diversity. Diversity encourages otherness.
Okay, however you want to word it, but I agree with you on the end goal, right, which is a variety of perspectives. On the social determinants of health, I put up a book at the end called Equality for Men. There's loads of stuff in there which shows how male inequality and men's issues, it's a different language, but male inequality and men's and boys' issues are determinants of poor performance, poor health later in life. So it's worth looking at. We just haven't looked at it. And on the marriage side, I'll let you take that, Warren.
Yeah, when you don't recognize something like misandry, you don't do studies about it. And when you don't do studies about it, when you don't recognize it, it doesn't get funded. And almost all studies are done by universities where there's funding for something. But when we look to common sense rather than just sort of like a study per se, you see there's thousands and thousands of studies showing that when we have divorces and we have an attitude toward fathers that I do a lot of expert witness work to help fathers become involved with the children, but the people who get to me have to have a lot of money in order to handle the lawyers and people like me to pay us. And so there's millions of kids that really need fathers or who are much poorer. They're getting left out of that. Now, do we have hard data on what happens with families that don't have fathers involved? And we have enormous data on that. But does that logically, common sense-wise, come from an attitude toward men as dads? Yes, it does. And with your sort of more liberal perspective, you should be right on board that because you want, I'm sure, children to grow up healthy and well. And we need mothers and fathers communicating with each other and just like, the reason I suppose the world's leading male feminist for 15, 20 years was because I wanted women to be respected. But as we began to accomplish that goal, I began to see there was a deficit occurring simultaneously, which was a lack of respect for men. And when you have things like books like Boys Are Stupid, Throw Rocks at Them, or those types of DART posters, and they go through systems, you can, if you had an understanding of what misandry was about, somebody would fund a study, measure things like that, and you'd have the findings you're looking for. But please don't be blind by the ideology of it's racism, it's sexism, you have the isms that are part of the political correct institutions, to also close your mind to another ism that is happening that is hurting all of us, just like racism is and just like sexism is. And it doesn't have to be a but, it needs to be an and, absolutely. Thank you.